on this topic of economics and debating. Now, as to my personal information, I was a debater at the University of Melbourne. I'm still at the University of Melbourne. I'm doing my fourth year, my honours year, my graduate degree. I'm a political science and economics student, and I have had a long involvement in debating, so at the high school level, but also the university level. I'm an AGCOR member for the upcoming Career World University Debating Championships. I additionally was the best speaker and winner of the Australasian Intervarsity Debating Championships, the fourth best speaker of the World University Debating Championships, and the quarterfinalist of World. So I'm really excited to be presenting today, talking about a topic that I think is really important and hopefully should be quite useful to you all in your debating careers and in future. So, no questions. I'll just get started. I will try to get through the content and then have a moment for Q&A at the end of the session. If you do have questions throughout, please feel free to message them in the chat and I can have a look at them, deal with them as we go through, particularly because this is quite difficult material for many people to learn about. So it's natural to have a lot of different questions about this content. Now I'll just switch over to screen sharing so I can begin talking through key points. Okay, so major things. First, we're going to talk about the origins of money. That'll be a very broad brush overview of finance and essentially what money is and where it originated from and what distinguishes money as a method of exchange from other traditional systems of trade. Then I'll talk about the basics of banking, and I'll go through the most common system of banking, not the only system of banking, mind you. I won't have time to touch on, for instance, Islamic banking today, where there are some distinct nuances and differences, but I'm going to be talking about the fractional banking system that exists in most liberal democracies. I'll then talk about market economics, and specifically I'll talk about the different types of market structure and how they originate from the fundamentals of trade and exchange and why they emerge, why some markets are defined by different structures in comparison to others. I'll then talk about how we regulate markets and what are some of the key considerations are. I'll consequently talk about the two major, I guess, mechanisms or actors in any economy. So you've got the reserve banks. Usually there is one central bank, one central reserve bank, and specifically their use of monetary policy. I'll talk about national governments and a discussion of state politics, but I'll keep it mostly to the national or federal systems of fiscal policy because that's where some of the key concepts are most applicable. I'll then finally talk about trade before briefly discussing some applications in debating, and that's when I'll probably open the floor to you all about how these insights can be used and applied to debating. So I'll just check if there are any questions before proceeding. Hey, Econ, that's good. Kiddo, so let's proceed. To money. Now, my notes are just going to be jogging my memory here. So you will probably need to take notes if you want to get the most out of this session, but it's also been recorded, so that can be useful as well. So we're going to talk about the origins of money first. Hello? Hello, someone's mic is on. Oh, yes, for sure. No worries. Explore, no worries. For typing that, that's all good. So Okay, so I'll go through session. All good. Origins of money. The reason we're going to talk about this is that it's pretty important for understanding different debates that come later in this session regarding how government should behave, how central banks should behave, how economies should function to benefit their citizens. So let's talk about the origins of money. Actually, in traditional agrarian economies, traditional hunter-gatherer societies, there always has been some form of trade. But typically that trade is done through the process of bartering. That barter process is when you try to find an equivalent value for goods that you're exchanging. For instance, you might decide that my book is worth of your books, or one goat is worth 2 sheep, or whatever it may be. The idea is that you're trying to equate 2 different types of good. You're trying to find essentially a fair value to trade at. Now that process continued for a long period of time and still continues in many societies today. But the innovation of money was important because it had a few different functions. The most important function that it has is as a medium of exchange. So instead of saying, for instance, that my book is worth 2 of your books, or half a goat, or a quarter of a pound of gold, and having to do that calculation for every single exchange, the idea was, what if we found we had a different way of valuing it? What if we could have a universal value for this good that then could be used to make this equivalence really easy? That was, of course, a price. I can say this book is worth $1. It's easier for me to trade that goat or for that other book or for whatever it may be, because a stable price level that testifies to or shows what the fair exchange is. So we don't have to constantly haggle over every single exchange. We have a clearing price that decides whether we trade something or not. And that's important because when you think of price, what you should really be thinking of is the number of people that want to buy the good and the number of people that want to sell the good. And it's essentially equivalent to this haggling. It's when are they happy to receive that amount of money? When are both people happy? Because it takes two to exchange. You need the seller of the good and the buyer of the good to be happy with the price that is provided. That's what a price is. That's where money originated from. That concept of mutually beneficial exchange is known as Pareto Efficiency. And that's the idea. It says, what if I'm happier with that good than you are, and you're happier with the money I pay for that good than I am? An example might be someone who really, really, really needs a pencil and someone who has heaps and heaps of pencils but really needs money. Now, if that pencil's selling at $1, that person is more than happy to buy the pencil for $1 because they really need a pencil. And the person selling is really happy to sell the pencil for $1 because they've got so many pencils that the consequence to them is very marginal. So but alternatively, that person who has all those pencils probably wouldn't be willing to, in fact, definitely wouldn't be willing to buy a pencil for $1. So that's the idea. The idea is that we have different wants and needs individually. That someone, for instance, who is poorer will need food a lot more than someone who's richer and already has food. Someone who's richer has certain tastes and preferences regarding a car, for instance, or a home that a poorer person wouldn't have. So people have different priorities, they have different interests, and they have different amounts of money. And what the price then is it's the adding up of all these different amounts of wanting something. So you might think of like the price of a good, so the price of a pencil being $1, as tallying up exactly how much people want to buy it and exactly how much sellers want to sell it. And that's the medium point where if you lowered the price, people wouldn't want to buy it as much, so wouldn't want to sell it as much. And if you raise the price, people wouldn't want to buy it as much. So the idea of a market mechanism and the idea of Pareto efficiency is you find a price level where it satisfies everyone to the greatest extent you can. And that's when, if you've heard about the invisible hand and a lot of traditional or very classical economic approaches, that's what people talk about. They're talking about the fact that through trade, through the expression of your preferences, expression of the fact that you want to go buy something, and the exercise of your free will. So you say, I'm not going to buy it if it's this price. I will buy it if it's this price. That is how you determine the price that is fair, in theory at least. And then likewise, it's true for sale. What price is worth selling at, whereas what price is not worth selling at. And ideally, in a perfect scenario, with people that know exactly what the product is, who have no perverse incentives or no incentives to strategize or cheat in any way, they will do a good trade. They will do a trade that will benefit both people, and the price will be set at that level. So that's why money exists, because it's not the case that it's what's called zero sum. There isn't a winner and a loser in every exchange. People might need something more than the person who's selling it, and the seller may need the money more than they need the good. So that's the idea of money. Money allows you to exchange things to make you both happier. I'll think about another example, right? Imagine if you're a farmer and you sell corn, and you're exchanging with a farmer that exclusively raises cattle. Now, the cattle farmer would really want corn, and the corn farmer would really want cattle. So they're really happy to exchange corn for cattle because they're both better off from that exchange, even though they're losing out on something, they're gaining more from it. But it's not true that one person's getting screwed over and one person's benefiting massively. So that's one of the key functions. Money makes that process really easy. Rather than having to constantly argue over whether it's a fair price or not, you can decide on a society-wide level what the price is, and individual companies can lower and raise their price, and everyone else responds to that. But that's the idea, that through a process of trial and error, people raising and lowering prices and figuring out whether they lose customers or gain customers, or lose suppliers or gain suppliers, you come to a level that's fair. The other functions of money are a bit more complex. You have money as a store of value, which means that the money itself has a price. That's known as the value of the currency. And that's useful because we'll talk about it later with regards to trade, but money is a store of value, but also used as a medium of exchange across currencies. But it's a store of value in that money tends to, if you sell something for money, that money holds its value to some degree. It has a value that you can trade for, whereas your cow might die or your crops may go rotten. So the idea is that you can sell something and then it will stay at the same value over time. So it's a store of value as well. But that's where the origins of money came from. And it came really from people mining originally for gold and creating gold coins that were literally worth the same amount. But one of the interesting things about money, as I explained briefly before, is that money, the value of money is determined by the supply and demand for it, how much there is in the economy, and what you're actually spending it on. So the Spanish empires, for instance, just a lot of money by finding more gold in Latin America specifically, in Peru specifically, to be very specific, but also Argentina. And what happened is they would go on these adventures to take gold and bring it back. But when they brought gold and silver and these other rare metals back to create coins, they actually just increased the amount of money. So what it meant was that you weren't actually creating any new goods or services. You were just increasing the amount of money. So everyone raised their prices because they realized that people had more money to spend, which made the individual unit of gold or silver less valuable. That process actually is a very, very old version of inflation. If you introduce excess money into the economy without having more things to spend it on or without growing economic activity, it's going to essentially inflate the value of that money in a way that will not inflate the value. You're going to inflate prices and decrease the value of that money over time. So that's another really important thing to consider. I'll just have a quick look at the chat before proceeding. Any questions so far? Any questions? Okay, great. I'll proceed to the next slide if there are no questions. But feel free to chuck them in now because it'll be the best time before I continue. Okay, fantastic. So we'll go next to the next slide. So we talked about this idea that money was invented to allow for trade, that money is a store of value, and that money is basically the value of money depends on how much money there is. So if you try to introduce more money, that doesn't make everyone rich necessarily. It can actually just make the value of each individual dollar less. And that's basically what inflation is as a fundamental concept. So what is banking? That money, the traditional thing people would do is put that money under your bed because you don't want to lose that money. You want that money to be safe. Now, the problem with that is it's basically a bit of a waste because while you have that money under your bed, it's just sitting there. There's nothing that money isn't being spent on anything productive. But when you think about it, you could spend money on an investment in a new business and grow the business and actually make more money in return. But not everyone has time to do that. So as an individual person, I'm a uni student, for instance, I couldn't be sitting here spending all my savings running my own business. I wouldn't have time to do it. I wouldn't have the capacity to do that. So what I would normally do is put money under my bed. But what banking is as well, it provides two services. Firstly, it's basically a security service. So if I'm putting money under my bed, I'm not confident about the security of that money. What I mean by that is that robbers, for instance, have a really strong incentive to simply take the money I have, to break into my house and to steal it. So I want to put my money in the bank as a safe. That's where it initially started. It started as a way to safeguard my money, to ensure that I could pay someone a small fee to protect my money, to ensure no one could steal from it because they could have, high-tech security and safety and all these things. But initially, then people realized, well, if I put my money in the bank and it's sitting there, why couldn't someone who is an expert in the economy or an expert in making money use it in the meantime? And that's essentially what fractional banking is. What fractional banking is, and this is a really important concept, and it's really bizarre to people when you think about it, is when you put your money in the bank takes that money and actually lends it out to other people. So banks are required to keep a certain percentage of deposits, that's the money you put in the bank, on them at all times. But that's traditionally only 8 or 10%. So if you have $5,000 in the bank, if everyone asked, could I please see my $5,000, it wouldn't be there. They'd have a fraction of that amount because they've actually taken that money and given it to someone to spend as a loan. So they've given it to them for a business loan or for a car loan or for a mortgage, a house loan. So and the reason why that's important is that banks guarantee you that they can pay you back. We don't think about that. We know that if we go to the bank, we can withdraw our money at any time. The point is that most people aren't withdrawing their money very often. Why banks have realized, hold on, we can use your money while you deposit it with us, lend it out to someone else, repay it, lend it out again and again and again, and then we just give back the money to the depositor, the people putting their money in the bank when needed. And that's really, really useful because it means you can massively expand the amount of money in the economy. Because rather than that money sitting by itself, that money is being spent on new business. It means that people can cheaply borrow to then spend on expanding their business or spend on buying an asset like a car or a home. Now, that's why the fractional banking system is so critical because you have a deposit guarantee know that you can put your money in the bank and you'll get it back. And also when you're borrowing, you know you can borrow that money, but then you're giving the bank a guarantee you can spend it back. So when you borrow money from the bank, what you're saying to the bank is that yes, we'll borrow this money, we'll take it from you now, but I can get it back to you. It's like an IOU in the next 5 or 10 years. And that's great because what it then means, right, is that the bank can lend that money to you and you can pay it back, and the bank can make a bit of money on that because they can make interest on that money. They can say, okay, sure, we'll charge you 10% extra. So you have to pay 10% extra in exchange for this loan. And so what the bank then does is then they'll pay the depositor, the person putting their money in the bank, interest as well. They'll say, okay, we'll give you 4% interest for putting your money in the bank. That's really good because it means that for me as an individual person, I want to put my money in the bank, not just for safety, because I want to make money. Now, inflation, which is traditionally in many liberal democracies 2 to 3%, but can vary across different countries at different times, but 2 to 3% is usually the target rate, means that you only make a very small amount of money, but it means that your money holds at a certain value because inflation occurs naturally as the economies grow and there's more money injected into the economy, etc. But the interest rate ensures that your money isn't becoming worth less. Your money holds its value over time. But that's the idea. That's why it's a win-win. Because in theory, a depositor puts their money in the bank pays them interest so that the money holds its value over time, and the bank holds it secure. And the bank, meanwhile, is lending out all this money to different borrowers who want to spend it on productive things. But you think about this and you go, whoa, this could go really wrong. And it goes really wrong quite frequently. There's a few ways it could go wrong. What if the bank lends it out to people who aren't going to pay it back? That's a big problem because they're going to be left with cash reserves that are too low and they're going to make too many losses. They can't afford to pay the interests to the initial depositor. And another way to go wrong is what if everyone decided to take money out at once? That's going to cause what's known as a bank run. Because what a run on the bank means is the bank essentially can't pay back the money because they have very few liquid reserves. When you say liquid, we're talking about money. Liquid means easily exchangeable. And lots of long-term liabilities or assets. So that means liabilities is in they're going to be paid back, and assets is in they have collateral. So when you borrow from the bank, you traditionally say, I'm going to borrow $40,000, but you can take my car if I can't pay it back. And that provides the bank with security because the bank knows they're going to get a certain amount no matter what. They can take that car back as collateral. But there are things that can go wrong here. If you lend to people that aren't reputable, that are going to take your money or that they can't pay it back, that's bad for the bank. And if people are going to all try to take their money out at once because they've lost confidence in the fact that the bank can pay it back because they're worried the bank will be like, we've gone broke, we can't pay you money. So they all try to take it out at once, which ironically then causes the bank to go broke. But that's a run. Those things can be devastating. So what are banks trying to do? And to a larger extent, the government is it's trying to sift through and find people who are safe creditors, safe lenders. That means that they know they're most likely to get the money back. And they want to make sure that the depositors feel confident that they can put their money in the bank and that they can withdraw it at any time without a huge issue. And one of the way they signal that confidence, they show that confidence, or they create that confidence, is by showing that they're using processes to lend money out. That's why banks ask for your income statements. That's why they ask for your spending history. It's why they ask for you to show that you can meet your debts, that you have a collateral, for instance. So that might be your own money, or it might be an asset you own, like a car or a home, to show that they are confident that you can pay back the money in some form. And the less confident they are, the less likely they are to offer you a loan in the first place. They can just reject you outright. And if they're a bit more confident, they'll offer you a loan at a very high interest. So what they say is, look, we know that like 10% of people in this situation aren't going to pay it back. So what we want to do is we want to charge you a rate of 10% interest or 15% interest such that we still make a profit even if quite a few people can't pay the loan back. And then you have your like really, really good, strong lenders, borrowers, people who are very wealthy, who can easily pay the money back and who are very reliable because they have a high income and they've got a proven track record, a good credit history is where we put it. So those are the kind of people the bank wants because that decreases their risk and it means they're assured of getting their money back, and it means they can decrease the amount of money they need to hold in the bank because they know they can keep lending and lending and lending and still making money. So that's the way the banking market functions, essentially. Banks are competing to offer really lucrative interest rates because you think about it, you often have many choices of bank and you want to choose the bank that offers you the best interest rate, but you know is safe. They offer incorrect interest rates. They have risks of stuffing up and not having enough money on hand, or they're not going to make enough profit, or they're going to charge an interest rate that's too high, at which point you'll go to a different bank. So it's a really complex process of essentially, again, educated guessing, although we'll talk later about the way in which mathematical models have evolved to help this process. But it's essentially a type of educated guessing, trying to figure out at what point should I price this loan, or how much interest should I offer, or over what should customers. That's the trade-off that businesses are constantly engaging in. They're trying to maximize their profit, trying to make money, but they're trying to avoid losing customers. They're also trying to avoid going broke. Are there any questions on that material so far? Feel free to chuck in any questions on this material so far before I... Any questions? Yeah, no worries. So either feel free to speak it or to type it into the chat, whichever is better. Let's go ahead. Okay, that's a really good question. So, what's happened? You're saying is that someone's borrowed some money, they couldn't pay it back, and then they've tried to flee, and the bank doesn't have enough money to cover it. So I'll get into this later, but this is quite complex territory, so it's a great question. Usually the bank will first of all try to will contact the government or will use debt collectors to try to get the money in. So there'll be people that will go to your door and be like, "Where's the money? We need the money. You've signed a contract. It's illegal for you to do this." Be prosecuted for failing to pay back money. If you've managed to flee overseas, no one can find you. That's a real problem for the bank. So the answer to your question is that this is actually why the banks are traditionally very hesitant to lend. They don't want to lend to people that they think might flee. Constantly trying to find ways to do this, to assess this, to make sure that they're not going to have the situation emerge. If it does emerge and they are likely to go broke, the bank might declare bankruptcy. So that basically might say, we don't have enough money to cover our debts, we want to cancel our debts, and the bank will go insolvent, so it'll fold. It'll be gone from existence. And usually the depositors are in trouble. But in some countries, the government will provide a deposit guarantee so that if a bank goes under, then a depositor will make sure they get their money back. And that's really useful because it means that people don't feel like withdrawing their money quickly because they know they'll get it back. And that then means that banks are less likely to go bankrupt because they're not going to have people constantly withdrawing money. So essentially that's my answer. Banks will occasionally
decide to do what's called a bailout. So governments will decide to bail out banks. That's when they traditionally believe that the economic consequences of a bank failing would be so substantial that it's important to ensure that you can stop that bank failing. That's a really complex issue, because if you stop a bank from failing that's actually a really bad bank that's constantly making really stupid decisions, you're going to keep harming consumers in the long term. It's a pretty difficult issue. But generally what I'd say is that banks really try to avoid this. They use debt collections. They try to engage in countries that have really strong legal systems to ensure they can make their money back. And they try not to take too many risks. But if it does happen, there are some avenues that can be pursued through the government traditionally to either prosecute these people or seek compensation for the company or compensation for the depositors to ensure they're safe. Let's answer these other two questions that have appeared. Is there any form of consent for the depositors to whether or not they agree to their money being lent? No. So when you put your money in the bank, you have no control over that, essentially. That's a part of the contract. So you have consent generally. So you put your money in the bank and the bank can lend, but the bank isn't going to say, hey, we're using your money like this. These days, your money is essentially just a few digits on a screen. It's like you might have $1,000 in the bank, and all that money is recorded in is, for the most part, just those numbers on the screen. It's not actually, it isn't a vault with your cash money being sitting there in the bank. It's just electronic. So that's how they actually do that. Yeah, so the interest and the whole agreement and the protection, exactly right to your next question, is entirely contingent upon them letting the bank lend it. So yes, the bank, putting your money in the bank can be considered itself an investment, yes. The risk is that the bank could go bankrupt. The bank, as I've explained before, they mess up, they fail to assess these risks properly, they might actually not have enough money on hand, or they might lose a bunch of consumers. So the risk to you as a consumer, the risk you have with banks is you're worried that the banks are going to either try to screw you over, so they're going to charge rates that are too high when you're borrowing and too low when you're depositing, or that they're going to fail, that they're going to go bankrupt and your money will disappear. That's where the risk is. That's why the safest investment is traditionally a treasury bond, which is when you buy a 5 or 10-year bond from the government. And the reason why that's a safe investment is the government traditionally has the power through the Reserve Bank to or central bank to print money. They have the capacity to borrow money on a much larger scale than anyone else, because they have control of money being printed. So the safest investments from the government, followed by really reputable banks, followed by less reputable banks, followed by the worst forms, which is just borrowing from your mates. That's really silly because there's no processes of vetting people. You can't figure out whether they're credit worthy or not, etc. Next question: what are the impacts when a big bank can't pay everyone? So if a big bank can't pay out, that can be really devastating because you lose your deposit. You lose your money. Your money you put in the bank, thinking it's going to be there, is gone. It can be horrible. Additionally, if a bank can't pay, a bank can't lend. If banks go under, that might make the cost of borrowing go up. And that's really harmful because you might have some businesses who are like, look, we want to grow, this crop. We know it's going to be super lucrative. Look at all the research we've done. We just need $10,000 up front to buy a little plot of land and to start growing the crop. That's an example of where you want money to be lent out because you want to be spending money on these really, really successful ventures. The only thing that's missing is the availability of that credit. That's an example of where banks going under or banks failing can be really, really harmful. Also, do banks runs make sense as a form of protest? Well, best form of protest is probably a consumer boycott. It's when you decide to use a different bank. So essentially, that's a form of that's just an individual, personal group of people taking their money out of the bank and putting it elsewhere. It's not a good form of protest in that it traditionally harms the depositors. If everyone takes their money out at once, the bank will declare bankruptcy, and unless the government has insured that deposit, then it's actually the everyday person who's put their money in the bank. They're the ones that are going to lose the money. There is deposit insurance. It makes sense. The best form of protest at a bank, if you think a bank is really evil, if you think a bank is investing in things that are like if they're investing in fossil fuel projects that could be damaging to the environment, or they're investing in quite malicious companies, or if you think that banks are being predatory in their lending, so they're deliberately lending to people that can't pay it back because they want to claim their assets, or if they're charging really predatory fees, so super high fees that will swamp people in debt. The best thing to do is as a form of protest is to say this bank is a bad bank, bank with this different one instead. Don't bank with the National Australia Bank, bank with the Community Bank of Australia. That's an example in Australia, that sort of momentum that might come. You might say, no, go to the community banks, use the local banks, invest in local businesses that are really reputable, that charge low fees. Don't go to these big banks that try to exploit you. That's the way you traditionally protest it. You wouldn't try to deliberately organize a run, because those bank runs would only really hurt people who have deposited in them. They would also hurt people who, the banks themselves, but the banks can declare bankruptcy. So this is actually quite important. If you're a corporation, one of the important things, right, is you can declare as an entity, you can declare you have incorporated liabilities. You can declare bankruptcy without personally being liable. So if I was Conor O'Brien, CEO of, Debating Australia, and Debating Australia went bankrupt, Debating Australia can declare bankruptcy, but I still have my personal money. I can't be prosecuted or hunted down for that money unless I've done something illegal in my time of managing the company. It's important because it means that, yeah, it'll hurt the company, but the people who run the company can actually leave the company and be fine. It's really useful because it means that otherwise, why would I start Debating Australia? Why would I start such a company? I don't actually have this company for context, but you would be really hesitant. You wouldn't want to take on the risk of being personally culpable, liable, the fact that someone could come and take your money because the big organization you run failed. That's also why banks actually don't suffer, the head of banks don't suffer as much. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but yes, it's better to boycott a bank or to switch banks than to try to organize a bank run as an actual form of protest. Okay, so that's generally why these concepts are important. So we've talked about fractional banking, a system where banks only keep a fraction of your deposits in the bank and then use most of them on lending, and then lend and lend and lend. We've talked about deposit and loan guarantees, the fact that the banks essentially are trying to guarantee they can pay you back, and a borrower is trying to guarantee that they can pay the bank back. And it's about trying to essentially get a mismatch, basically realign your lending and borrowing in a way that means that both people are better off, so that you borrow money and you can spend it on something that's really productive and you make money in the long term, or you pay the loan back, and that the lender makes money too because they're making the interest rate on that. And likewise for the depositor, you want it to be such that the bank makes money lending out your money and you make money on the interest. Finally, we talked about credit and risk. We talked about the fact that banks try to minimize their risk by assessing whether you're credit worthy. How likely you are to actually pay this money back? Are you as a person a safe investment? So this is a bit of a sidestep. We'll go back to market economics. So I'm going through this journey for you to build the real fundamental intuitions of the way economics works. We're trying to strip away from the jargon and talk about what these terms actually mean. So if I'm using any terms that are confusing, do chuck a message in the chat, but I'm really trying to explain the underlying dynamics. So let's say we live in a society where we have these individual people that are trading goods and services. They have money to do so. They have dollars that are the representative of the value of different things. And they are then putting their money they earn as income from a job in the bank. Now, there's one important thing we haven't talked about yet, which is basically, well, how are prices determined? Now, I gave you an example of one market structure, which is the optimal market structure according to economists, and that's one of perfect competition. Now, the way you think about perfect competition theoretically is think about when you go to a fruit market and you have 10 different stalls that are all selling strawberries. Now, imagine the strawberries are the same. They taste the same. They look the same. And imagine they're all priced at $2. If someone lowers the price of a strawberry punnet, a box of strawberries, to $1.90, what will happen? Well, essentially, every consumer will go to that store because why would they want to spend more money on this exact same product? It's like, here's an analogy. If you wanted to buy a phone and you are in a building and that one store sells a phone for $100 and the store literally next door sells it for $110, you'll always buy from the $100 if it's the same phone because you're not wasting any money. There's no time. There's no difficulty getting there. It's just about which is the cheapest price. So that's what a perfectly competitive market competes on. It competes purely on price, and that's why in theory a lot of those classical economists have a lot of good things to say, because if every market functioned like in perfect competition, then every price would be fair because you'd be able to figure out through trial and error the exact perfect price such that it was high enough that the businesses wouldn't go bankrupt, because if it was too low, they wouldn't be able to afford the cost of growing and supplying the strawberries, and therefore they'd lose money. And if it was too high, a different business would then lower their costs and everyone would go to that business. That's a system of perfect competition. Now, the next system is one of what's called monopolistic competition. Now, that one's a bit different, and there are lots of different features here. There's lots more detail I'm not going to go into. But the idea is that what if these products are a little bit different? So what if you go to a mall and you have all these different fast food stores, and now they're selling everything at roughly the same price, and it's pretty similar, like pizza, burgers, it's all the same sort of stuff. But what if like there's one recipe for pizza that's tasty? So what if you think that, like, for instance, you just like the Burger King burgers more than the Hungry Jack's, so the Burger King burgers more than the McDonald's burgers. That means you'd be willing to spend a bit more money on the Burger King burgers, even if the McDonald's one's cheaper. And that's important because in monopolistic competition, it's basically more to do with your tastes and to do with things like how things are advertised, how you understand them, how you perceive them, than just the price. Another good example is fashion. Now, a lot of pants might look quite similar, but the brand name will matter. A Calvin Klein pant is going to be better than a Bonds pant, and that set of pants, and that's really important because it means that you're not just functioning according to price, but you're also thinking about quality, you're thinking about brand name, etc. So monopolistic competition can be quite good, but it's not a perfect market. People can have loyalty to certain companies, and that means they can exploit you basically. Because even if it only costs them $5 to produce a burger, they could charge $7, even though the other company might charge $6, because they are the only ones with the secret recipe, and they know you're willing to spend more money to get that secret recipe, that beautiful taste, because it's the only place you can get it from. You can't just go to the next store and taste the same quality burger. So that's important because in a monopolistic competition market, it's similar to a perfect competition market for fruit, for instance, except the consumer gets a worse deal generally because the producers are likely to make more profit if they're companies that have a really good brand reputation. And also people are less likely to choose better products that aren't well known. So what if there was a new company called Skinnies that emerged that sold skinny jeans? Now they might be 10 times better in quality and cheaper than Calvin Klein. But lots of people will still buy Calvin Klein jeans because they trust them. They think they're a good brand. When you see Calvin Klein, you'll be like, oh, Calvin Klein. But Skinnies, no one knows what Skinnies is. So you don't have that factor. So you see how that's important because it means that basically in a monopolistic competitive market, consumers are generally worse off and certain businesses are worse off as well because consumers are more likely to stick with products that they think are better but might not actually be better. They're more likely to pay more for them, so the businesses are making more money. And up-and-coming businesses will find it much tougher because they might not have enough money to advertise quickly. They might not be able to get the word out about how good they are. And there's a lot of incumbency bias, a lot of bias based on companies already being trustworthy and well-suited and seen as really reputable. So what that means is that market is good, but it's not as good as perfect competition. The next one is an oligopoly. So this is quite common in the banking sector. So that's a good little segue here, where you might have 3 or 4 major banks. Now, oligopolies can really fluctuate wildly as to how they behave. When there's really strong competition, when the banks are all really fighting hard, they can actually drop prices really, really, really low because they want to beat each other. They're trying to become the head honcho. And the reason why is that they can beat the other banks and get more business, they can start jacking their prices up in the long term. This is all simplified, by the way, so do feel free to ask questions. And also, obviously, a lot of what I'm saying is quite broad brush. So there are a lot of exceptions here, but I'm just describing the dynamics in general. So companies in oligopolistic markets traditionally try to lower their prices initially to beat the other competitors and then raise their prices if they're the only one left. But sometimes they'll decide, well, what if we don't compete on price at all? What if we all just jack up our prices? Because there's no other alternative. There's only 3 or 4 banks in the country or 3 or 4 banks in the city, and people can't buy anywhere else. So what's the point? They can't boycott us. They've got no choice. So that's an example of what's called collusion, when companies deliberately choose to set the price together. Now that's a real problem because basically, as I explained before, it means that other companies find it really hard to get into the industry. Another example, and a traditional example, is the flight industry, because you can't just set up an aircraft line. I can't just be like, oh, yep, I'm going to set up Australia Airways tomorrow, because you've got to buy planes, you've got to have an arrangement with airports. There's a lot of money that goes into that. So even if I had a brilliant idea as to how to revolutionize flying, I can't get the money to then spend on making that idea the reality, because even if I have, unless I'm a hugely wealthy person that has an enormous amount of collateral or an enormous amount of general dosh, of money, to then spend on that. And a lot of people are locked out. So that's why oligopolies are generally harmful. And then the worst form traditionally is a monopoly. So imagine, you might have your recycling company, paper company. It's only one competitor. There's no one else. There's one market company. In those markets, consumers basically have no power because they need the service. If they need it, if they really need to recycle, for example, a good example is a water company. If they really need water, then what can they do? They can't go and switch providers. They can't stop buying because they need water. So they're going to go out and buy water. Now, some people call this kind of monopolies, often are called natural monopolies. So the example of the water company is good because think about how you would have competition in the water market. You couldn't have like 5 different taps in your home that each connected to a different water company, so you could switch on the Conor O'Brien tap if you didn't like the Dil Hakim tap if you didn't like the Amira tap. It depends on, you need like, just using a silly example here for debaters, but if you need, often it makes a lot more sense, and price-wise it's a lot cheaper just to have one company do it. But often that's when the government is the one that starts providing it, because people can say, well, I'm going to let the government do this because we can vote the government out if they do a bad job of this. Whereas a private company, you can't vote the company out, you can't change their behavior at all. There's no accountability if there's only one company. Whereas sometimes you say, actually, it's best for the government to do this service because we can vote the government out, we can protest, we can hold them accountable so that if they try to screw us over, we can make sure that they're going to play ball. So that's a really good overview here of markets, because what it explains is that markets aren't just as envisaged by Adam Smith and traditional economists. They aren't just ways of perfectly assessing the price of a good or service. They basically are good or bad at doing this based on how they're structured. So perfectly competitive markets are really good at setting a price that makes profit minimal and makes consumer benefit maximal and makes everyone relatively happy. Monopolistic competition has more diversity and quality and taste, but it's harder for new players to come into the market. Oligopolies are tricky because they're quite large. There's only 2 or 3. Sometimes prices are really good. Sometimes people collude, but over the long term, generally oligopolies are harmful. And finally, monopolies are quite harmful because they gouge prices. Now, what I'd say here, what I mean by gouge prices, they raise their prices up because they're the most powerful actor in the economy. But there's one counter theory here, and I'll call this basically the Amazon or Google theory, which is that if you have one really powerful company or a few large powerful companies, they can massively expand the amount they produce or what they do, and they can have a huge amount of capital. And they could spend that money on research and development or other things that small little companies can't. So that's one of the trade-offs, is that if you have really big companies, they can do things that little companies can't. They can invest in the future. They can invest in technology. They can offer really low prices in the short term. Whereas smaller companies are really focused on immediate competition, trying to beat their competitors. They can't spend money on these sorts of things. And that's why it's a really open and active debate at the moment about like how we should regulate the tech industry or how we should regulate companies, like not just the industry, but specific companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon, because there are real distinct benefits from having these mega companies. But the problem with these companies is often they charge extortionate prices in the long term. And even if that isn't true, so some of them are accountable, they hold a huge amount of political sway. So your local strawberry farm doesn't have much political influence because there are so many different strawberry farms. But if you're Facebook, if you're a company that controls one of the, like a few of the most important social media networks in the world, that's an enormous, your decisions make a huge difference to how society functions. So there's an added question of these companies can do a lot of really exciting things. They can invest in cutting edge technology. They can really do a lot of good for the world, but also they can be really exploitative and wield a lot of control. And they can actually end up making a lot of money for the owners of these companies at the expense of the average person. So that's a complex debate. It's not clear cut, and it's not true that every market should be perfectly competitive. But what I want you to get the idea of is this idea that there are there are numbers of consumers and there are producers in different markets. Competition in markets where it's really easy to start up a business and you're competing with similar goods. And monopolies or oligopolies usually form when it's really, really difficult. There are some sorts of startup costs or really expensive initial costs. So you can't just run your own airline. You can't just run your own football club, for instance. You need to do a lot of other things, which means only very few people can ever enter that industry. And that will change how goods are priced. It will change how much consumers are benefited, and it will change the kind of goods that people produce. So I guess that's the key benefit of oligopolies and monopolies is people argue that, well, these companies can invest in producing better goods quicker rather than perfectly competitive companies that are only really focused on lowering their price in the short term. And they're trying to produce better goods and services to outcompete each other, but they traditionally have far less money to do that with. So that's general overview. Now, that probably gives you an idea as well of the idea that of what consumers are doing, and consumers are trying, and this operates under the assumption of rational choice. So it's the assumption that consumers are trying to maximize their own interests. Now, we've already added a little bit of complexity here. So we've talked about the fact that consumers might have preferences with regards to the types of goods and services they buy or the brands they buy that might not be rational. But there are also other things at work here. So consumers, for instance, are quite bad at thinking about the long term. Consumers are more likely to trust. Consumers don't always have perfect information. Consumers might buy based on emotion and feelings. They might react to advertisements rather than based on what's purely best for them. Those sorts of things all function as well. And that will change how markets are structured, what goods are offered, what companies do, and how they act. But that's a general idea. I want you to think about this web of businesses that are competing to win money and consumers who are wanting to buy things that benefit them. And we're evolving from this idea that, you just have a goat that you pay $100 for, and a book you pay $10 for, which is a more dynamic situation where the goat market is different to the books market, which is different to the telephone market, which is different. All these different markets have unique characteristics, features, but they often diverge from the optimal scenario of everyone being happy and all being mutually beneficial, because it's always mutually beneficial, but it's a question of are we helping consumers as much as we should, and are we allowing for small businesses to become large ones and become successful and help society in general? So check there's no charge issues. I'll just answer any questions now. If you have any questions on the market section, please feel free to put them in the chat now and we can have a chat about that.
great first question. What are the usual small clashes on a monopoly regulation debate? So, very, very classical discussion. And this is almost always the case in these debates. When you think about it, and we'll talk about regulation a bit later, but if you're trying to break up monopolies or restrict what businesses can do, that's probably, that might lead to two things. Firstly, it might lead to price increases. And that's harmful because it means that consumers are worse off. So if you put a lot of conditions and restraints on companies, it might force them to push up their prices because they have to pay administration costs to deal with those regulations. Or the regulations themselves might be taxes or other restraints that require them to buy new equipment or these sorts of things. The second thing is that people might argue, well, some businesses just won't exist anymore, or new businesses won't emerge. And that will harm consumers because they won't get new products or really successful new businesses providing new products. Whereas the flip side is basically quite intuitive. It's that regulating these companies means they don't do things that are really harmful. So if you think of an oil company, you might regulate that oil company to stop them from polluting, or to make it illegal to make them have basic safety standards. That will benefit consumers, but also this benefit people who have nothing to do with the industry, people who are just citizens who might be affected by something that those companies does. That's a general clash. Usually on the pro-regulation side, you're basically trying to explain social benefits of any of the regulations you're talking about that are usually quite intuitive. And the opposition is trying to talk about why it'll increase costs and decrease long-term investment and long-term business growth. It's a really good question. As an affirmative team on a regulation debate, you're wanting to try to essentially minimize consequences for businesses, explain why it doesn't matter as much for consumers even if it does happen, and just talk about why the importance of the regulation is so massive. Whereas opposition, wanting to actually explain why having newer and cheaper goods in the long term, or having things like really, really innovative, like think about the iPhone and like really great products that make everyone's lives happier and better, is more important than the occasional environmental catastrophe or problem. Obviously, I don't believe that. I'm just explaining to you how you would execute that. Sir, if big companies like Amazon goes on and start like then new startup will actually be started. The question. I think the problem with Amazon, and what people argue, is that Amazon is doing something that's quite anti-competitive. They're both acting as the basically the means of selling stuff. So you can use Amazon Prime to export goods, sell goods, trade. And then they're also selling their own stuff. Sorry, I think can anyone else hear me? Am I audible? Or was that just E2's laptop or phone or? Okay, thank you very much. Basically the problem with Amazon is that Amazon will also sell Amazon products. The idea is they can give preference to their own products in order to make money. So imagine if you're the one, it's like being the referee of your own football game. Like you can call penalties wherever you like, you can do whatever you want. So Amazon can promote their products massively on their own platforms, make a lot of money off that. So it makes it harder for small companies. You're saying that if Amazon goes on and sells each and every product, then the idea is that, yeah, Amazon can be really good because it makes it easier to sell products. New companies can use Amazon to reach consumers. Otherwise would never have that actual chance. So new startups can emerge because they can use Amazon Prime or Amazon services to start selling their products. So that's the clash. Companies can sell their products, companies can make more money, companies can invest in things that are really good for society, but they might do really bad things along the way because they're focused. Companies have a fiduciary duty, which means a legal duty. The director of a company has a legal duty to maximize shareholder value. You own a company, or you're the director of a company, you're appointing a director, you're appointing someone to run the company. You want them to make as much money as they can for you.
If that means harming society, unless there's an explicit rule or regulation, basically that's what's going to happen. Or unless the backlash from society will be so large that it'll harm profits in the long term, people will do this because their obligation is not to society. It is to the company. It is to the people that own the company, and that is their incentive. Just before I continue, am I speaking fine, or is there any other questions? Do I need to slow down or speed up or anything you want me to go over again? If not, I'll just continue. But feel free to chuck that in the chat before I continue. Okay, fantastic. So that seems like it's all good. That's nice of you to say as well. So there is no further requests. I'll just continue. But do message them in now if you do have them. Great. So let's continue on our whirlwind tour of economics. So now we've talked about the origins of money. We talked about where people put their money and what banks do with your money. And we've talked a bit about how markets work. So the next thing we're going to talk about is regulating markets. Now, there are a few things you can do to change these behaviors. One of the most common problems that occurs in markets, apart from competition, is a problem of externalities. Now, I'm going to talk about this first because it's really, really important. Now, let's say I trade with my friend. I buy my friend's coal because I want to burn it for my own company. Now, what a market will do is if it's a perfectly competitive market in particular, that's great because I'm better off because I get the coal to burn, and he's better off because he gets the money and he's got a lot of coal. He doesn't need any more coal, but he really wants money, and I desperately need some coal. The issue is that coal is going to create pollution, and that pollution is going to be emitted into the air. It's going to then be harmful to the surrounding community. We'll have worse air quality, and it's going to be harmful overall to society because in the very long term, that coal emission may then contribute to global warming, which will then contribute to a variety of different climatic conditions and harms, such as increased number of natural disasters, increased decreasing air quality, rising temperatures generally, drought, all those sorts of things. So the problem is that when I'm trading with someone, sometimes it only just benefits me and them, but often it has third-party effects. And what that means is it has flow-on consequences for the rest of society. And the rest of society had nothing to do with it. They didn't want you to sell or buy the good. They had no consent. They had no party. There were no party to that agreement. So the real problem is that you might have the market price, which is the price that I sell and buy a good for, but then you have this socially beneficial price. You have the price that benefits society the most overall, because we're not taking into account social costs when we're selling a good. And that's really the market theory of climate change. The idea that using fossil fuels was really great for the producers of the fossil fuels and the consumers of the fossil fuels, so people who are burning that coal, people using electricity, using all these different things. But it's created these enormous costs that weren't actually factored into the price in the first place. Because if you didn't factor that into the price, if you considered the enormous social consequences and social harms of that good, like you would in a one-to-one relationship. So for instance, you might be like, oh, I want to buy this pen, but the pen might leak on me, so I'm going to decrease the price, or I'm going to ask for a lower price as a consumer, or it's going to leak on me, so you produce less, so you have safety conditions, whatever it may be, to change the price. Point being is that if you factor in that cost, it will be a much more expensive good. But it clears a really low price because it's only about, if I'm a rich person living in a rich suburb,
would you care about the consequences? You wouldn't think about it as much as the people who are suffering the consequences. And it's particularly a problem too, because often the countries that are doing the emitting are actually not the ones that suffer the consequences. So even though the United States and China and India are the ones that are doing most of the burning of fossil fuels, it's Tuvalu of all countries that is going underwater. That's the kind of consequence we're talking about. We're talking about a country that barely emitted anything. It's suffering this acute climate crisis where refugees are being forced from their homelands with no prospects of return, and there's no refugee law that's set up in place to actually allow for those people to resettle and find a new home. So I guess the gist there is that you can have these enormous external harms, but also enormous external benefits. So I'll give you another example. Let's say I want to go to school and I pay $1,000 a year to go to school. That's how much it costs. Now, going to school isn't just good for me. It's good for me, but it's also good for society. Because what if I go to school and then become a doctor and then I start treating people? I'm producing this really valuable social good. I'm contributing back to society. But the price of my good being considered is not that it isn't considering the social benefits of me being educated. It's only thinking about the private cost and the private benefit. How much does it take for tables and chairs and all these different things? So in a pure market mechanism, it'll basically schooling things that are socially productive, like schooling or healthcare, will be underproduced, because even though it's overall really beneficial for everyone involved, the private cost is much higher than the private benefit for the actual price. Whereas for things like fossil fuel burning and consumption, cheaper than it should be, because the consequences for society aren't felt by the people buying and selling. So what people have decided to do in many situations is you can use taxes and subsidies and this is the most traditional mechanism the government has. They can just either give you money for doing something good or tax you for doing something bad. So one of the traditional mechanisms is what's called carbon tax, where basically we say we're going to charge you a certain amount of money for every ounce of carbon you emit, every kiloton of carbon you emit. And the idea of that is that you do a few things. You dissuade people from using carbon, so you make non-carbon burning alternatives like solar and wind more profitable. You earn tax money that you can spend on helping the environment. And generally, you also encourage those companies to minimize their coal usage themselves or their carbon usage themselves. So find ways to make their carbon usage cleaner or to offset their carbon usage to make money. As the subsidy, you might say, actually, the government's going to fund half of my schooling because that's going to lead to overall way more social benefit in the long term. So the reason the government does this is the government's in a position to evaluate the society-wide consequences of different decisions. They're not just thinking about the short term. They're not just thinking about the individual. They're meant to be thinking about everyone. And that's obviously really contentious. So you can have government failure too. So where the government's ineffective at regulating, when the government is captured because there are lobbyists that convince the government to avoid that, because they'll say, we'll move countries. If you're a coal production firm, we'll move countries if you do this, or we'll sue you if you do this, or we'll withdraw money from your campaign if you do this. So there are all these ways this can break down. There's government failures too. But basically, externalities are market failures. It's when the market is wrong and pricing things incorrectly because it's not factoring in the society-wide cost. So that's one unique thing we haven't talked about yet, where what if exchanging good and service doesn't just benefit the two people involved, but benefits many other people or harms many other people? That price is not going to be the right price. The right quantity of goods and services won't be sold. So you need to find ways to change that. And one of the easiest ways to change that is to tax or to subsidize. You tax the harmful things. You tax cigarettes, you tax sugar, you tax carbon emissions, and you subsidize education, you subsidize healthcare, you subsidize environmental preservation. The second thing you can do is have what's called competition law. So something that's quite common in Australia. You have the Australian Consumer, what's it called? Consumer Competition. It's ACCC. The Australian Consumer. I can't remember the exact acronym. My apologies, but it's ACCC is the name. And what it does basically is it'll prosecute companies for doing dodgy things. So it'll be looking out and it'll be watching out for collusion. Are these companies trying to fix prices together? Are they trying to do sneaky deals together? Are they becoming too big? Do we need to break them up into smaller parts? Are they advertising their products fairly? Are they conveying all the relevant information to consumers so that they can make decisions? Are they upholding their contracts? That's what these entities do, and they exist all around the world. And they're designed basically to nudge these markets to be more effective. Basically, these markets need to be safer, better, less kind of essentially not making the same mistakes they could make if they were left to themselves. So a lot of free market economists say the market will fix itself. The government shouldn't do anything at all. The government will just screw things up. Competition law reflects is the fact that the government can be really important for stopping things like abuses of power, ensuring information is provided to everyone so they know exactly what they're doing, and also to stop evil or companies engaging in evil behaviors. So stopping companies from becoming super big and then exploiting you, stopping the kind of practices that could be really damaging, stopping environmental dumping, stopping waste dumping that can have really damaging consequences in the long term. The other thing you might do is you might have a state-owned enterprise. So not just subsidizing a company, you might say, hey, we actually need this company called Australian Water. It's going to provide all the water because this company can focus on the public good rather than just private goods. Now, one of the big problems with this is that obviously if you do this, that if you provide it for free, then you're spending a huge amount of taxpayer money. And that's just taking money out of the pockets of people indirectly. So what a state-owned enterprise can do is it can actually itself charge a fee, but the government can like cap it or set a certain price, and then they earn that money and then they spend it. Now the problem is people go, well, why can't you just cap prices really low? Like, why can't we just make education $10 for everyone? And the problem there is that essentially someone's got to pay. And if that happens, then it's the government that's it's basically facing huge. So if it's a government-owned enterprise, it's operating in that area. If it's only the government, so only the government water provider, then or what a price limit will do. So price ceiling, you might say you can't charge more than $1 a litre for water. Then that's going to make it basically such that taxpayers are forking out. So that's an important thing to consider. And that might be harmful because what if like really rich people are using a bunch of water and then poor people aren't using much water at all, but poor people pay a certain more tax than they use water? So it could be harmful. It could be redistributively harmful. But what if you're setting a price limit across the entire economy? If you say we're going to make sure that tomatoes never go above $2, the problem with that is that only government companies could ever compete because if it cost you $2.20 to produce the tomato as a private company and the tomato could only sell at $2, you would just stop selling tomatoes because you're losing money. You're losing money over the long term. You'll go bankrupt. That's why people talk about, and I'll go into this a bit later, unfair Chinese trade practices. They're talking about the fact that it's also true of the European Union and indeed a lot of different businesses where the government will subsidize them, lower their prices below that of a private company, even if the private company is producing a higher quality good at a lower price. But they can't compete because the government can artificially lower that price. So the idea is you only really want to subsidize things that are really socially useful. You don't want to be subsidizing things just to prop them up because it's unfair on some way along the lines. But you might want to subsidize a solar company. You might want to subsidize education if you think it's really socially beneficial. And yeah, as I finally explained, you might have safety laws and requirements and those sorts of conditions to ensure that things aren't being harmful or malicious. So you might have laws regarding, for instance, children's toys to ensure people don't swallow them or injure themselves in some way. So I'll just again take a moment now to ask questions. So if you have any questions now, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'll proceed to talking about central banks and national governments and how they behave before then getting into the Q&A, a trade and then Q&A at the end. So feel free to ask any questions. Hello, I can't hear you. The question I can see here. If Amazon? Hello, yes, sorry. Yep, go ahead. What's your question? So that's a really good question. Essentially. So what companies are trying to do is make profit. And if they believe they can raise the prices during Christmas because people, let's say, for example, a Christmas turkey. Now, particularly in Judeo-Christian societies, it can be really popular to buy a turkey around Christmas. So normally, you got to remember that, as I explained before, that prices are determined by the forces of supply and demand. How much people want something, how much people want to sell it. And I'll explain this briefly. Let's say you think, let's talk in the abstract. I might think that normally a bottle of hand sanitizer is, to me, worth $2. During the coronavirus pandemic, oh boy, it's worth $50. Yeah? Sanitizer can be worth different prices for different people. And that's important because the price, again, if the price of sanitizer lowered to $1, so there are some people that would buy it that wouldn't previously buy it. And the same way you think about it, like if you go to a shop, you might be like, oh, that $10 sandwich is too expensive. But if it's $5, you're like, oh, that's pretty good. And if it's $2, you might be like, I have to buy the sandwich. It's a bargain. So the point is that prices are never uniform. Prices are never always beneficial for everyone in the same way. Some people get more benefit out of a price than the other because it's the average of everyone's demand for a good and the average of the supplier's capacity to supply the good. About setting prices higher at Christmas. People might decide at Christmas, for instance, that, well, a Christmas turkey is a lot of people wanting Christmas turkey, so I can now charge a higher price because people want it far more. And that might be an effective thing to do because what that might be doing is basically signaling, if you charge high prices up, that's basically allowing those companies to make money, and that might lead other companies to enter that market, seeing the opportunity to make money, and the price will eventually go down. Because more companies will enter, more supply will increase, there'll be more alternatives, it might be cheaper, etc. So, but there are almost always opportunities for profit. So, and it's good for companies to make some profit, because if they didn't make money, they probably wouldn't, like companies want to make a lot of money. Like companies might stay in the game of selling turkeys because they know that around Christmas they can make a lot more profit. When they're being too exploitative or when consumers are getting ripped off. So the answer to your question is, if they raise prices around Christmas for turkeys, no, it probably wouldn't be something the government would step in on. But if they quadrupled prices, that's when the government might be like, hold on, this looks like an illegal form of gouging. An example might be, if someone's about to die and you say, I'm going to sell you this drug for $1 million and it has a 5% chance of work. Government might ban you from selling those kind of drugs because even though there's a 5% chance of it working, they say this is overly exploitative. The person can't make a fair decision. It's ripping you off. Government traditionally would intervene. So on to this next question. If Amazon buys out failing industries and then takes over that business spectrum as well, will that be deemed anti-competitive behavior? So the answer is it depends. It really depends because the reason it depends is that if they're buying a company, if they're buying it depends on the scale. So if they're becoming a monopoly, if they're buying a company that's really important, then that might make the government think twice about whether or not that should be allowed to go through. So I know in Australia, for instance, often a lot of those kind of mergers of really big companies in critical industries are blocked because it's seen to actually be really, really harming society in the long term because it'll lead to long-term price increases, long-term consequences. A lot of the time, mergers and acquisitions happen all the time. So it might just be more efficient for a company. So let's say, Apple buys out a company that produces really, really good glass. That might be good because then Apple can produce that, they can get the insight from the glass and can produce that iPhone with the new glass at a lower price than if they were buying the glass from the glass company. So not all mergers are bad. Often they can be really good. It's about whether that industry is really important and if it's really critical that it's separate. And that's a judgment call. What I try to explain here is it's really nuanced and difficult. And that's why, and also just as an aside, that's why economics debates are great debates because in my opinion, as an adjudication core member and as someone who sets motions quite a lot,
I think it's best to set motions that are genuine intellectual debates, not just ones that are in debater land can be discussed, but ones where the smartest academics and policymakers are like, we're really not sure. That's an example as well. I think, whether or not you should break up tech companies, whether or not you should ban those kind of mergers. These are questions where we're not really sure. It might be the right thing, it might not be the right thing. It's hard to assess. Often it's a case-by-case basis. And that's when debating economics is really, really useful, because there are clear harms and clear benefits on both sides. And the team that wins is the team that provides the best explanations for their material and then explains why it's really, really important and useful. So if there are any more questions, please message them into the chat. Otherwise, I'll proceed. Any other questions? So I'm just giving some time. So that's actually a good question. I'll actually answer this quickly before I proceed. Yeah, with regards to this, so one thing people started doing at the start of coronavirus, they figured out that if they bought up a lot of sanitizer, they could resell it at a really expensive price because people were desperate. And that's the kind of behavior that a consumer competition commission, I think that's what it's called, Australian Consumer Competition Commission, ban. It's similar to in sporting games. Often they ban people from reselling their tickets in front of the stadium. They basically say that you resell them and the people can't consent. They're not going to be informed. They're not going to be rational when they make this decision. So it's unfair to do. That's actually a good example of where people would stop that sort of behavior from happening. Okay, so I'll briefly talk. And again, I'm sorry, I'm really going around the world here, but I think I'm trying to make clear this session isn't meant to be exhaustive. I want you guys to go home and to read about all these different topics. I'm just trying to give you a general narrative to understand how everything links together and why we debate these things. So then when you go on and do an economics debate, it doesn't seem like a foreign language to you. It seems like it's, oh, wow, like, economics, it makes sense. I understand the broad ideas that are in economics. So I decided to go this more broad approach to give everyone an understanding of the key issues and the key points in economics, not just one particular area, because I think that stuff is best understood by your own reading and learning rather than just through a presentation. But I think the presentation can help you with the context, the overall ideas. So reserve banks. So what a central bank does is they essentially regulate the supply of money, and they regulate and they lend money to consumer banks. So the Reserve Central Bank is basically a government-supported bank that has certain special rights. They don't sell, they don't take consumer, they don't hold consumer deposits. They don't lend money to consumers. They lend money to the government. So the government's borrowing money. Essentially, they're owing the central bank that money. The central bank, importantly, has the power to print money. So they can print more money and inject it into the economy. Now, that sort of behavior causes inflation, but it can lead to a number of benefits. So while it might lead to inflation, that's when the average price of goods and services goes up over time, the benefits of economic growth might be worth it. And usually that's what happens. So the government will borrow money, and they'll do so by issuing bonds or by printing money, or getting the Reserve Bank to print money. And then they'll then spend that money on socially useful things like education, on healthcare, or on long-term research and development, on these sorts of ideas. And that then can mean that in the long term, the economy grows and it's really beneficial. But I'm briefly going to talk about reserve banks. So reserve banks control they indirectly control interest rates. So what they do control is they control essentially the bank lending between banks. I'm not going to go into the complexities of this, but the general idea is they, practically speaking, set rates, and that flows onto interest rates. So what they do, how they price lending, how they affect lending rates, then change interest rates that banks charge, or the banks essentially what they then do as well is they control, and they do so by changing the supply and demand of money in that market. And they can additionally print money. So what the Reserve Bank is trying to do is fulfill a variety of different objectives. So in some countries, it's only one. Some countries, the Reserve Bank is only trying to stop inflation, because inflation can be super, super harmful, because inflation can cause what's known as a wage inflation spiral. So I'll give you an example. If prices go up 10%, so if you're like, wow, every good I own is going to, every good I purchase is going to go up 10% next year, you're going to lobby your company to pay you more money to cover those costs. And if you lobby your company to cover those costs, the company will then pass on that increased wage as a more expensive good. And that will then lead you to lobby again. And it'll create this spiral where prices keep going up and up and up until money isn't really worth anything at all. So that can lead to a situation called hyperinflation. It affected Germany post-World War I. It's the most commonly cited example, but it's also affected Zimbabwe, for instance, where if you mismanage the economy, if you mismanage the supply of money, you can actually lead to really, really devastating economic consequences. So the bank in so many countries has one goal, and that's to keep inflation in check. And one of the key instruments it has is to control interest rates, because that will control how much borrowing and lending goes on, and it controls how much money is printed, and that will control how much, basically that will control the amount of investment, and that will then control the amount that prices go up or down. So they can essentially cool down the economy, stop new money being printed or stop new investment, and they can stimulate it as well. So that's but additionally, some central banks have further functions. So they can have functions of trying to promote economic growth and reduce unemployment. So that means that reserve banks, or central banks rather, might try to cut interest rates to boost lending and to stop people from saving their money, try to make them spend it to help the economy. If you think about it, if you earn a really low interest rate on when you deposit your money in the bank, that might mean that you want to instead spend that money. Whereas if you're earning a really high interest rate, you might want to save the money. So that's the kind of mechanism they use. So essentially, reserve banks can print money, they can change interest rates through this really complex mechanism I'm not going to discuss today, but you feel free to look up. And that's going to then the price of borrowing, the price of saving, of lending. It's also going to change the price of assets, because if you can borrow money really easily, that's going to increase the price of houses and cars, because it means that more people can borrow money to spend on these things. So there's a flow-on effect in the market. I want you to know this because usually central banks are independent. Sometimes they're not, but often they are independent of the government, and often they're pursuing this long-term agenda. And the general reason why they're doing this is they're trying to stop catastrophic inflation, and they're trying to stimulate economic growth. But they can also get it wrong. So they stuff this up. They can actually themselves cause recessions by mismanaging the economy. But that's in a broad sense what the central bank is there to do. It's there to lend money to the government, so the government can run budget deficits, so borrow more money than it gets from spend more money than it gets from taxes and other assets. It's there to regulate the price of borrowing and saving, and to try to make people save or make people spend more. And it also can have this flow-on effect on the way things are priced, particularly assets, because assets are usually the sort of things you spend money on using a loan. Because you don't get a $10,000 loan to buy a lot of sandwiches, because then it's perishable. So you buy the sandwich, then you've eaten the sandwich, and then you have all this debt, and you have no way to pay it back. But you might buy a home because you can sell the home in a few years' time and still pay off the loan. So conversely, you have the national government. So the national government can also be managing the economy. So when you think about the macro economy, you're thinking about how to promote jobs and economic growth, and that's usually about economic activity. You want people spending and you want people investing. So as I explained before, central banks can affect that through the interest rates they set and whether they print money or not. And governments usually do so by whether they run a deficit or a surplus, and then what they spend it on. On the first question, people think that governments should run surpluses, so they should tax more money than they spend, because it's like, in the same way that it's bad for you if you're an individual person to rack up debt. But it's really different, because I'm an individual person. I rack up debt, I'm liable for that, and I can go bankrupt. Whereas if you're a government, in most situations, in most countries, if you rack up debt, you can just print money, or you can just borrow from the central bank, and you have no problems. The problems will come if there's a crisis of confidence in the government, and people think that the government itself can't actually pay off those loans without causing hyperinflation. But you see how it's a much more drastic scenario than just the normal status quo situation of, oh yeah, you're printing money or you're borrowing money, etc. So basically, governments use the budget as a mechanism. If they think the economy is weak, they should run a budget deficit, because what that means is they're taking less money out of the economy than they're putting in it. Because you're basically borrowing money from the Reserve Bank, spending it on education, infrastructure, healthcare, whatever it may be, and you're taxing less money. But if you're running a surplus, you're taxing money and you're just taking it and sitting on it, and you're not spending it on things. Because it's not, governments don't run a system of fractional banking. They don't lend. If they're saving money, if they've got a surplus, they're usually paying down debt. Or they're just putting it in a sovereign wealth fund or whatever it may be. That's the best case scenario, when they have a sovereign wealth fund that does actually lend out money. So a good example of that is when a lot of the Nordic countries that had massive oil industries taxed those oil industries, put it in a sovereign wealth fund. And that fund is now made interest over years and years and years that they can use to spend on education, healthcare, infrastructure, etc., without even taxing people. So that's a fantastic example of where that sort of mechanism can work. But essentially, governments also do the second role of trying to spend on socially useful things. So if you spend on infrastructure, if you build a road, that road makes it way cheaper for businesses to transport their goods, and that lowers prices, and that increases trade, and that benefits the society and the economy. So, or the government might spend money on things that are really useful for society, but not economics. They might say we're going to spend money on promoting movies and arts and culture, because the market won't do it itself. So that's an idea that's really important here. The governments are not just trying to help the economy, but they're trying to help the long-term state of economic growth. They're also trying to we can't. So people know education matters, healthcare matters. As I said before, they'll subsidize these things, and they'll tax bad things, and they'll regulate things. And they might also often invest in things like science and technology to help society in the long term. That sort of stuff. They'll also interact with reserve banking, so they might regulate. So that means that they're going to respond to what reserve banks do. So if the central bank is trying to stimulate the economy, they might decide, oh yeah, we need more stimulus too. We're going to borrow. Or they might decide the central bank's doing enough. We can run a surplus. So there's a bit of a response mechanism here. They work together in tandem, even though often central banks are independent. They respond to central banks in this way. I'll now just let anyone ask any questions they might have before I proceed to the final section, and then have an extended Q&A. So any questions, please ask now. Thank you. Okay, I've got a question. The crisis that a few economies are in at the moment is they're dropping their interest rates drastically but aren't succeeding in stimulating consumption because people have become so pessimistic and risk-averse regarding the economy. If this is the case, alternatively drop the interest rate to zero and therefore can't go any further. What alternatives are available then? Okay. So I've kept this session at quite a fundamental level, so I'm trying to keep it at the basics, but I can get into this briefly. What you're talking about is a situation which the central bank, so let's be specific, a central bank lowered interest rates or lowered their cash rate, as the cash rate is the official term, to zero. So what that means, right, is basically rates can't get any lower, so if you go negative, and people have to pay to put their money in the bank and are literally getting paid to borrow. Now, there have been some experiments with negative interest rates, and there's been some signs of success. So Japan's experimented a little bit. There have been occasional experiments over time that show that you can actually go even further to stimulate it. But obviously, you don't really want to do that. Governments still have heaps of power. So this is what the central bank can do. What the alternative is for the government, the federal government, is federal or national governments can just borrow a lot of money. One of the things that's become quite common during the coronavirus is to give cash handouts for people to spend immediately on buying goods and services to keep the economy going and keep it moving and keep it afloat. Because people keep on spending money, businesses keep selling goods, businesses keep paying incomes to people spend those incomes on goods. It's like a cyclical process that multiplies money. So we talk about the money multiplier. It means that when you pay $5 for a book, money actually goes a lot further because you pay that $5, a little bit of that money goes into costs, a little bit of that money goes into labor or profit. That profit and labor is then taken by people. They then spend that money again on new things, and it cycles around and around the economy. So as for the central bank, there are also other alternatives. They can do things like provide forward guidance. So essentially explain that they're going to keep rates low for a long period of time, which provides some level of certainty, which is helpful for markets because it means that they know they can keep borrowing, or it means that like there's more stability and certainty so people can keep their money where it is or whatever it may be. There's additionally, they can use unconventional monetary policy. So one situation is quantitative easing, which is another word for essentially printing money. And they buy up government bonds in order to inject money into the economy. That can cause inflation, but it can be really useful in times of crisis where economic stimulus is desperately needed because there is a relationship between economic activity and between inflation. So if economic activity is really low, it's unlikely that this sort of stimulus will cause inflation. I'll just briefly explain because there are two different types of inflation. There's what's called pull and push inflation. The pull inflation is when on the supply side, things get really expensive. So let's say there's a drought and it costs way more to produce agricultural goods. That's push inflation. And that's really hard because if you then started printing money, you just keep causing more and more inflation, even though economic growth is really bad. So that can cause what's called stagflation, where the economy stagnates and there's a supply side problem. What you want to do is, and there's inflation. So what you want to do in that situation as a government is you want to spend money stopping that problem. You want to spend money trying to solve the drought or spend money on subsidies or that sort of thing. You might have and pull inflation. So when there's a lot of demand for goods because people have more money to spend, and so good prices keep going up and up and up. So in that situation, you want to cool down the economy. You want to run up budget surpluses. You want to take money out of the economy to stop inflation getting out of control. That's my answer to that question. The government can do a lot of different things, and the Reserve Bank has a few other tactics. There are many other tactics too, actually. If you want me to message you some articles or something extra resource, I'm more than happy to. But for today, I'll just go through more of the basics of trade and those sorts of things, because even though it's really interesting, you'll actually discuss the nuances of central banking in a debate. It's more just the fact that it exists. That's a thing that's important, and to understand what interest rates do, how they work, what inflation does, how it works, what growth and incomes do, and how they work. Okay, so let's finally go into this little section about trade. So basically, this whole process we've talked about is assumed a closed market where you buy a good for a price. Someone makes money off that. They then pay an income or a wage to someone. They then spend money. It cycles round and round. Sometimes they spend money. Sometimes they put money in the bank. If that money goes in the bank, banks can lend it out. It's this complex series of interlinked webs. And then we've introduced the government and the Reserve Bank that kind of regulate and affect the way those markets operate. But the final thing to consider is the fact that people trade. They don't just operate in their own country. They operate in other countries too. So businesses can export. So an Australian company can export Australian goods overseas, and consumers can import. So an Australian, I can buy a lot of different goods and services from overseas and ship them across to Australia. Now, what a tariff is, and you'll hear this word quite often in debating, is it's a tax on imports. So you might put a 10% tariff on Japanese cars coming into Australia. And that's important to consider, because that tariff can be really damaging on the one hand, because that tariff increases costs for importers and means they can't buy the highest quality good. Whereas the flip side is that that tariff might actually protect a domestic company. Because if you expose your domestic companies to international competition, the international competitors might smash you. And that means your companies will fail, even if in the long term they would have been successful. So that's the nascent industries theory. That some of these taxes are really useful because they protect your company so they can develop and grow and get larger, and then they can compete on price. But then the other side of it is subsidies. So some countries, as I mentioned before, like the EU and China, will subsidize their own companies to produce goods that are really low rate. Now, the problem with that is that it might be artificial. So these goods are actually much cheaper than they should be, which means that these companies can beat you on price and then raise their prices in the long term once you've gone bankrupt, and then you're stuffed. The general gist, though, is that people trade, and that there's this process of tariffs and subsidies that affects how fair that trade is. And countries generally try to reach trade agreements to essentially decide whether there should be tariffs, whether there should be subsidies, and negotiate those conditions. Because countries essentially want to have free access to their exporters. They want the exporters to be able to export to as many markets with no tariffs, but they also want their own domestic companies protected. So it's a bit of a confusing situation. Now, why is trade good? Why is trade good? Basically, trade is good as an idea in the abstract because it can allow for specialization. So let's talk about Australia, for instance. Australia's got this massive, wide open plain in the middle of the country and a lot of really good agricultural farmland to produce, soybeans and to produce a bunch of different agricultural products. And Australia has a lot of resources. But Finland doesn't have many of these things, perhaps. It might have oil, but it might not have a huge number of these things. But Finland might be good at making wood. And if Finland's really good at making wood, and we're really good at making these things, it's much better for us to trade with Finland than to have to make our own wood industry and for Finland to have to make up their own agriculture industry. So what trade can do is it can lower prices for all, because just as you can trade within your own country and you can get benefits from trade or from exchanging things, you can actually allow countries to specialize based on what they do best. So the Germans are very good at making cars. So it makes sense that we can buy German cars at a really cheap price rather than having to buy Australian cars, which could be a fair bit worse. Now, the problem, though, obviously, is that it can make, as we've seen with the coronavirus situation, is that specialization can make the rest of the world economy really dependent on one market. So Wuhan just happened to be the center of a lot of medical equipment production, which is incredibly, incredibly unlucky. But it meant that when coronavirus hit, that because that economy, the world economy is so specialized, many other countries didn't make these products. So the US, for instance, didn't even make penicillin, couldn't even make penicillin, a very, very basic antibiotic drug by itself, and it relied upon importing those drugs from India and China. So the general gist here is that specialization can provide massive benefits, and that these countries can provide goods at a better, higher quality and a lower price. It can create dependence. It can destroy your own domestic companies if done poorly, and it can also lead to the formation of really, really large multinational corporations. The problem with these companies is because if you have one market, a company can't become that large. But if a company has multiple markets it can enter, it can become so large that essentially it
it can like be larger than countries. It can have huge amounts of power and huge amounts of clout. So you think about the fact that Philip Morris, a cigarette company, is bigger than Togo, Trinidad or Trinidad and Tobago. That's the kind of situation you have where individual companies can be literally the size of countries and can make countries change their laws to harm their own citizens but to benefit them because the amount of power they have is huge. Whereas if you had a bunch of different small companies, if a company says lower your liquor, change your cigarette laws or else we'll leave, the country would say F off, we don't really care. But if there was one massive provider, then you can be held at the behest of that company. It's also true of that company. If everyone relies upon Chinese medical products, everyone relies upon European milk, then that country can use that as a bargaining chip, and that can be a real problem for your national security. The final thing is talking about development arcs. Again, this is a very broad brush discussion, but you can think about how you want to develop. So people talk about whether you want to have an agricultural revolution or whether you want to transition from agrarian farming to manufacturing to then higher end production, and whether you want to have import or export surpluses. So do you want to be an export-based economy or an import-based economy? A lot of that's also based upon the value of your currency. So if you have a really cheap currency, then you want to export because it's going to mean that it's really cheap for other countries to buy your stuff and really expensive for you to buy their stuff. And the inverse is also true. But I'm not going to go into detail here because basically it's really, really complex. It's really, really complex. It's really sophisticated, but I just want you to understand the general gist that people talk a lot about the macroeconomic strategies of countries, how they can use exports to make money in the long term and to develop in the long term. And there are many different arguments and disagreements about that can happen. So applications to debating. You have a lot of debates about just generally policy debates. So any debate which has like a model that can affect consumers and producers and businesses. You have explicit taxation and regulation debates. So I've already explained here a lot of the trade-offs, understanding, are you eradicating a social ill? Are you benefiting society in some material way? Are you harming businesses? Are you harming consumers? Are you harming people who weren't involved in the first place? In finance debates, when you're talking about banking, you're talking about lending and borrowing. You're talking about how much economic stimulus there is. And you're talking about whether you're lending to people who are risky or not risky, or whether you're creating systemic risk in the economy that can lead to bank runs, that can lead to recessions, that can lead to the sort of consequences you see in an event like the global financial crisis, or that can lead to shortfalls of capital that means you can't respond well to things like the coronavirus. But it's also generally an intellectual approach to considering harms and benefits. So you can think about economic and non-economic losses and gains. You can think about exchange between two people, and you can think about societal consequences. You can use economics really as a mode of thinking for a lot of different debates. You can think, and you can use the rationales. So remember, I've talked about like the idea of competition and when there's power dynamics and all these different things, and how power dynamics shape the way pricing works and the way quality works and those sorts of ideas. That's transferable for politics, for instance. You could just insert, instead of company, say political party, and instead of consumer, you can say voter, and instead of dollar, you can, or spending, you can say voting, and you can basically describe how two-party systems are different to many multi-party systems and why information is important and all those different things. So you can use economics as an intellectual approach to assessing topics that are non-economic as well. So I really hope you've enjoyed that session. I've tried to make it as broad as possible, but what I like to do with these sort of sessions at the end is just explain that I'm really always willing to help with this sort of stuff. I find this stuff really interesting. I haven't gone into a huge amount of detail today. I've just tried to provide you a really broad sweep of this topic. So what I'd like to do is I'll give you my email address in the comment here. If you ever want to contact me, ask me questions, get resources, anything like that, always feel free to ask. And additionally, I'd recommend, if you want to read about these topics, think about the Financial Times, think about The Economist, think about Investopedia has a lot of really good explanations, but also think about the foreign affairs style explanations. So foreign affairs, foreign policy, Council on Foreign Relations, these resources are also really good. And just your old-fashioned online resources. So just research, an introduction to macroeconomics, an introduction to microeconomics, an introduction to financial economics, an introduction to regulation or any of these things explained, you can usually find some really, really good resources on that stuff. So overall, like, thank you so much for having me today. A real pleasure. I'm really excited to serve in the education call for this tournament and to be giving this session. I'll just give everyone a chance to message in any questions they have, and then we'll wrap it up for today. So I'll finish screen sharing, but I just want to say again, thank you so much. It's been a real privilege presenting today. I always really enjoy these sorts of initiatives, and so I hope you found it really valuable. If you haven't, please feel free to tell me that. I always appreciate constructive feedback. If you found it useful and you want to ask follow-up questions, you can message them in the chat, but I'll also provide my email address for further questions and clarifications. But thank you so much. It's been a real honor to come today. Thank you. So if you have any questions, please feel free to message them into the chat now, and I can go from there. Okay, so I'll answer a few questions here. Stock options. Okay, so the basics. Option, you have two types. You've got a call and a put. Generally talking about the right, but not the obligation to buy or sell a stock. A call option is basically the way I explain it is that you might have a stock which is worth $50 right now, and you buy a call option.
that is the right, but not the obligation, to purchase that stock at a price, let's say $50, over the next month. You might pay $2 for that option. The idea is that if you think, and you do that, if you think that the price is going to go up, because if the price increases to $55, you pay the $2 for the option, you then exercise the option, so you pay $50 to buy the stock, you then sell it immediately, and you make $3 per stock on the spread, is what they call it. Whereas a put option is when you exercise the right, but not the obligation to sell products. You might pay $2 to sell a stock at $50 because you think it's going to go down in price. It goes down to 45. You then sell it. You then buy it back at 45, and you make $3 per stock on the spread. The reason why options are really interesting is because they're a derivative. They're derived from the initial price of the stock. They're there because they allow for speculation, essentially, on the one hand. So if you think that the price is going to go up, you can speculate to benefit yourself. If you think it's going to go, but you can also hedge. So let's say you have invested in the company, you can buy a option. The reason why you do that is that if the company share price value goes up, you make money. If it goes down, you lose money, but then you can exercise the put, so you sell and you make difference off the fact that the price went down. That allows you to hedge. It allows you to decrease your risk. That's really important because if you have options, you can decrease your risk. Then you're more likely to invest, because the risk is what would actually dissuade you from investing in the first place. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. That's what options are really useful for. But they also allow you to take speculative positions. So if I bought a call option and invested in a company, I'd be adding additional risk because I'm actually really betting hard on the outcome that it's going to increase in price. That's going to be good if it pays off, but it increases my overall exposure. So that means I'm more exposed to fluctuations. I'm more vulnerable if things go wrong. That's the idea of how options based. There are quite a few debates because on the one hand, because essentially stock options debates are just about, are we using these options to hedge? Are we trying to decrease risk? And that can be really useful because you can have like other sorts of options like futures or forwards options, for instance, where you can lock in a certain price of a good or service essentially, which can make trade much more accessible. For instance, and it's a really common thing with like trade with particularly African nations actually that are producing agricultural products, but there might be a lot of instability in the production or exporting of the good, and prices might fluctuate a lot over time. You can actually just you can lock yourself into a futures contract, so that's a type of option, and that will mean that the prices are more stable, and that means you're more likely to trade. If you don't have that stability and if the price is going to fluctuate wildly, you might not actually trade in the first place. Does it make sense? So it's a debate about whether or not it's going to be used for those sorts of purposes, or whether banks are going to take really aggressive stances with options and try to make a lot of money and they fuck up. But also can be talking about the fact that with options, you can it's like not actually like it's detached from real money. Exchanging a lot of money, even though no one's actually producing anything. It's synthetic. It's a financial instrument. It's not actually a real product. And the problem with that is you can say that these options can create wild fluctuations in economic outcomes that have no relation to the economy. They're purely related to the financial sector. So I hope that answer provided you with enough background so you can have a read up in more detail. But again, feel free to email me if you have any further questions. No worries. So the next question is it possible to bail out depositors directly instead of banks during financial crises? Yes. In Australia, for instance, we implemented depositor insurance. So deposit insurance up to $250,000. That was really successful because it meant that none of our banks went under. The problem with it, obviously, is it's really expensive. But the thing with depositor insurance is you can say, I'm going to get deposit insurance. Then depositors don't withdraw. Then banks don't go under. So you end up spending no money at all. Problem is that there's a risk of spending a huge amount of money, but it's not guaranteed. The reason why you might want to bail out banks is because if the banks fail, there could be a huge flow-on consequences to where money, like
people being owed money and not receiving it. And that can then lead to further economic harms. So it's actually a really complex trade-off about whether or not you want to risk that sort of economic harm, but also you want to punish the bad behavior of banks that occurred in the global financial crisis. So that world's clash. So there's a motion relating to promoting long-termism. Okay. This will implement substantial measures to impose long-termism in corporate investment culture. The problem is this is similar to options to some degree, but the idea is that a lot of corporations will spend money on boosting their share, spend their time boosting their share value. Companies will have, again, these short-term incentives. What that means is they can boost their returns in the short term, they can look the goods, but in the long term can actually go bankrupt or create a huge amount of harms. So the clash here is curbing long-termism, curbing short-termism worth it? On the one hand, it creates a lot of clear benefits because you're creating long-term accountability, but it might harm investment, it might harm business development, and all of these things are going to lead to long-term economic consequences. So that's the kind of answer you might give to that question. It's about on the opposition, explaining why all these measures are going to really harm business growth, business investment. They're going to really undermine the economy. Even if it becomes more stable, it's going to harm growth. From the government, you're trying to explain why instability is so damaging to the economy writ large. Okay, so there are no other questions. I'm going to wrap it up there. But thank you so much for this wonderful session. It's been a real privilege to be here. I'll finish up now. If you have any further questions, please feel free to email me or to message me directly on either on Discord or on Facebook. It's been really great to present today. I hope this has been useful, and I hope you all have a terrific time tomorrow and for the rest of the sessions today at this tournament. Everyone.